Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be diving deep, really deep into Sanatan Dharma. You guys have shared some truly fascinating material with us.
Yeah.
And I got to say, right off the bat, it presents a very specific and I'd say unique perspective on this incredibly old tradition.
Definitely. Right from the beginning, these texts, they really emphasize that while Hinduism and Hindu are terms we hear all the time, they actually view those as labels that came from outside the tradition.
Really, so not terms they use themselves.
Not exactly. What they really point to as the accurate name, the name they prefer, is Sanatan Dharma, and they make it clear that's important to them.
Sanatan Dharma. Okay, so before we get too far, maybe we should break that down a bit. What does it actually mean?
Okay, so in Sanskrit, Sanatan means eternal, something without a beginning or an end. And Dharma is a much broader concept. It can be religion, but it also covers things like duty, ethics, even natural law. So putting it all together, Sanatan Dharma, at least as it's presented in these sources, basically means the eternal religion or the eternal duty.
Eternal religion, eternal duty. There's definitely a sense of something timeless and universal there, right?
Oh, absolutely. And the time scale they're talking about, it really emphasizes that idea of eternity.
Okay, now we're getting to the good stuff.
Hmm.
So according to these sources, how far back does this Sanatan Dharma actually go? I mean, we know it's old, but how old are we talking?
Well, get ready for this. They claim it goes back a mind-blowing 155.522 trillion years. That's when they say the current cosmic cycle began, and Sanatan Dharma was reestablished.
155 trillion.
Wow. That really puts things into perspective, doesn't it? I mean, our normal historical timelines, they just pale in comparison. Absolutely. We're talking about timescales that are almost impossible to wrap our heads around. And it's not just a random number they threw out there. They actually base this immense age on calculations that are laid out in the Vedic scriptures. They take it seriously.
I'm starting to see that. And, I vaguely remember them bringing in a quote from the Bhagavad Gita about this whole eternity thing. Am I remembering that right?
There you are. They specifically reference a passage from Bhagavad Gita 11.18. In that chapter, there's this incredible scene where Arjuna gets to witness the cosmic form of Krishna. And in that moment, he actually addresses Krishna as the one who maintains this eternal religion, this Sanatan Dharma, and also refers to him as the oldest being.
So they're using that to underline just how timeless this tradition is, at least according to their view.
Exactly. That's how they're interpreting it.
Huh?
It's really fascinating.
It is. Okay, so we've got the name Sanatan Dharma, the eternal religion, and this mind-boggling time frame. But these sources don't just stop there. They also outline what they call the 6 pillars of Sanatan Dharma. Now, this is where things start to get really interesting for me, because these pillars really lay out the core principles, the ethical and philosophical foundation. So let's dive into these, shall we?
Let's do it.
So what's the first pillar all about?
The first pillar is all about truthfulness. But it's not just about avoiding telling lies. It goes deeper than that. They present it as a much more active principle. Actually speaking the truth, standing up for truth even when it's difficult, and really aligning your entire life with what's true. It's about embodying truth.
Wow. Okay, so truth as a way of life, not just words. That's something that resonates with me. I think that idea probably transcends specific traditions, right? Something a lot of people can connect with.
For sure. I mean, truth, it's kind of a universal value. But it's interesting how they frame it here as an active force you have to constantly work towards.
I like it. It's challenging. What about the second pillar? What's that all about?
So the second one is compassion. And the way they describe it, it's all about a feeling of universal connection, this idea that all living beings are essentially brothers and sisters. And they really tie that concept to specific practices, like being vegetarian.
Ah, okay. So not just a theoretical compassion, but putting it into action.
Right. They specifically mentioned vegetarianism, avoiding leather. It all stems from this idea that we should minimize harm, that we shouldn't unnecessarily take life. They take it seriously.
So compassion that extends to the entire web of life, not just humans.
Absolutely. And it's not just about diet either. They connect this compassion to other choices we make, like they say abstaining from things like alcohol, drugs, tobacco, even gambling, they say, and relationships outside of marriage.
Okay, wait a minute. How do they tie all that to compassion? It seems like a bit of a jump.
Well, the way they explain it, these things can lead to a lot of suffering. They're saying that these activities can cause harm to families, to communities. So by avoiding them, you're kind of practicing compassion on a broader scale.
So it's like a ripple effect. Your personal choices impacting the well-being of those around you.
Exactly. It's a pretty holistic view of compassion. They're connecting the personal to the societal.
Interesting. Okay, on to the third pillar. What do we got?
This one is austerity. And basically, it boils down to this. A conscious choice to live simply, detaching yourself from material things. They mention all sorts of practices. Non-materialism, keeping your diet simple, fasting, not being overly demanding or making a fuss, cultivating humility.
Humility. I feel like that one's a bit rare these days.
Yeah, it's not exactly trendy, but they see it as super important. Lowering the ego, they say, chanting Vedic mantras, reducing your desires, even going on pilgrimages. It's all about shifting the focus from external things to inner growth.
It definitely goes against the grain of our consumerist, gotta have it all kind of culture.
Yeah.
But I can see the appeal. What about the fourth pillar? What's next?
Number 4 is cleanliness. And this one, it's both about the external and the internal. So on the practical level, it's things like taking a bath every day, brushing your teeth twice a day, keeping your surroundings clean.
Okay, so basic hygiene, but they're taking it a step further, right?
Exactly. It's not just about looking good or avoiding germs. They tie cleanliness to a spiritual discipline, to purifying yourself. It's pretty fascinating.
So hygiene with a spiritual dimension. Interesting. And what about the fifth pillar?
This one's charity. They actually advocate for making regular donations to causes they deem worthy. Specifically, they talk about supporting temples dedicated to God, people who are dedicated to serving God, and those who preach God's glories. But they also include the poor and needy in this, so it's a pretty broad definition of charity.
So supporting both the spiritual and the material needs of the community. Okay, makes sense. We're up to the sixth pillar, the final one. What's it all about?
This is a big one. They call it spiritual education. And honestly, this is where they really get into the heart of their philosophy. They talk about this massive body of Vedic knowledge, get this. They claim it contains over 1 million verses. And all of it, they say, originates from God.
1 million verses. Talk about a lot of reading.
Right. But don't worry, they do highlight some key texts. They say the Bhagavad Gita is like the essence of this wisdom, and that it's actually considered the direct word of God. Then there's the Srimad Bhagavatam, which they say goes deep into God's actions and basically the entire history of humanity from the very beginning.
Okay, so the Bhagavad Gita and the Srimad Bhagavatam, those are the go-to texts if you want to understand this perspective.
That's what they're saying, yeah. They really emphasize the importance of regularly studying these scriptures, especially for kids. They see it as a way to connect with this eternal knowledge.
So 6 pillars, each one a pretty fundamental principle. They really lay out a comprehensive ethical and philosophical system, don't they?
Oh, yeah. It's pretty impressive when you see it all laid out like that. But it gets even more interesting. The sources also make a point of highlighting certain teachings they view as especially unique to Sanatan Dharma. And some of these, well, they go against what a lot of people might assume about, Hinduism, which is how it's often labeled.
Okay, now we're getting into the controversial stuff.
Yeah.
This is what I love about these deep dives. So what are some of these unique teachings that they're really emphasizing?
Okay, so one of the big ones that they bring up is that there's no concept of eternal damnation in their view. They explain that due to the inherent compassion and forgiveness and mercy of the divine, ultimately, every soul is going to find its way back to God's kingdom.
No eternal damnation.
Yeah.
So a pretty different perspective from some other traditions that, talk about eternal separation from God.
Oh, yeah. It's a huge difference. It really changes the whole outlook, the whole long-term picture. And it's not just that. They also really emphasize the eternal nature of the soul, that each individual soul has always existed, that it's currently embodied, and that it will continue to exist just in different forms after this body dies.
So reincarnation, that's a big part of this.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely central. And then they also stress this idea of one supreme God. They're very specific about that. One God who's real, who can be seen, and whose presence has actually been proven, they say, through various appearances throughout history.
Seen and proven. That's a pretty strong claim. A lot of religions talk about God, but they don't usually phrase it quite like that.
It is a bold statement, and that's kind of their point. They're drawing a clear distinction here. And that's not all. They also talk about this vast eternal knowledge that was compiled by God. And then there's the law of karma.
Karma. Okay, so explain that one. What's their take on karma?
They see karma as this infallible law of cause and effect. Basically, every action has a consequence. And those consequences, they shape your experiences, even determine what kind of body you'll have in your next life. They're pretty clear that it's an inescapable principle, like gravity. You can't escape it.
So actions have consequences, but it goes beyond this life.
Yeah.
Right? It impacts future lives, future incarnations.
Right. It's all connected. They also really emphasize the universal brotherhood and sisterhood of all living beings. That's a big one for them.
It seems like this whole perspective is built on this sense of interconnectedness, this idea that we're all connected, all forms of life.
Oh, definitely. It's woven throughout their teachings. And this interconnectedness, it extends to how they view our relationship with God. They have this practice of offering personal service to God through deity worship.
Deity worship.
Oh,
Okay, so we're going to unpack that one a bit later.
yeah.
I'm curious about that. What else is on their list of unique teachings?
Well, they talk about this idea that God actually manifests in different universes to engage in divine pastimes. And they have this whole cosmology, this idea that creation itself is cyclical with these immense timescales like we talked about earlier.
So creation, destruction, it's all part of this ongoing cycle.
Exactly. And you know what? They also make it a point to say what they don't consider part of Sanatana Dharma.
Oh, really? Like specifically calling out certain practices.
Yep. They specifically mention rejecting things like slavery, the taking of captives during war, looting, circumcision, cursing, stoning. They're very clear that these are not things they endorse. And they say none of this is found in the Bhagavad Gita, which they consider, like a primary scripture.
So they're drawing a pretty clear line in the sand there, defining what they consider Sanatan Dharma and what they don't, even if those things might be associated with other traditions.
Right. They're very intentional about that.
Okay, so this is all super fascinating. But I want to shift gears a bit now and get into what they call the science of you. Basically, we're going to delve into the soul. What do these sources say about the nature of the soul? Like, what are its fundamental characteristics?
All right, so they describe the soul as being equal in all living beings. It doesn't matter what form you're in, whether you're a human, an animal, even a plant, the soul at its core is the same.
So everyone, every living being, is on equal footing from a soul perspective. That's a powerful idea. What else do they say about the soul?
Okay, so they also say that the soul is eternal, that it's full of inherent knowledge and bliss. It's present within all those life forms we talked about, humans, animals, plants. And they say it's completely indestructible.
Indestructible. Wow. Okay, so the soul is this eternal, unchanging essence that inhabits different bodies. Are there any other defining characteristics they give for the soul?
Yeah, a few more. They're very clear that the soul is beyond any physical designations, like it's neither male nor female, and it's not defined by your color, your caste, nationality, religion, your health, wealth, even your age. None of that matters to the soul.
So the soul is beyond all these external categories. I like that. Where do they say the soul is located?
Well, they say it resides in the heart, and get this, they describe it as being incredibly tiny, like 1/10,000th the size of the tip of a hair. But even though it's so small, they say it's what illuminates the entire body with consciousness.
So it's this tiny, powerful essence that animates everything. Pretty amazing. Anything else about the soul that they highlight?
Oh yeah, one more big one. They emphasize that each individual soul is essentially a part of, like a family member of, the Supreme Soul, God. It's not just separate entities, they're connected.
Okay, I'm starting to see a pattern here. A lot of emphasis on interconnectedness. Now, they also use an interesting analogy to explain the soul's journey, something about science.
Yes. They bring in the fundamental law of physics, the conservation of energy, that principle that energy can't be created or destroyed, only transformed.
Right, right. I remember that from science class. What does that have to do with the soul?
Well, they use it as an analogy. They say that the soul is like that eternal energy,
Yeah.
and the physical body, well, that's just the temporary form it takes. So when the body dies, the soul, just like energy, it doesn't disappear. It just transmigrates to a new form, a new body.
So that ties back into reincarnation. It's not just a belief. They're trying to connect it to a fundamental principle of science.
Exactly. They even quote a line from the Bhagavad Gita that says something like, the soul changing bodies is like changing clothes. It's that natural.
Okay, that makes sense. So death isn't the end, it's just a transition.
Right. And they constantly emphasize this difference between the soul, which is eternal, and the body, which is temporary. They point out that when someone dies, we say, he passed away.
Yeah, we do say that, but I never really thought about it that way.
It's subtle, but they're saying it shows how we inherently understand that the soul and the body are separate. And to support this whole idea, they bring in a bunch of verses from the Bhagavad Gita that talk about the soul's continuous journey, how it's indestructible, how it's always existed.
They really like the Bhagavad Gita, don't they?
Yeah, they do. It keeps coming up.
Okay, so the science of you, it's all about understanding the soul as this eternal, unchanging essence that's separate from the physical body. But now I want to shift gears again and talk about the science of species. How does Sanatan Dharma, or at least how do these sources, categorize all the different life forms we see in the world?
Okay, so they bring in the Vedic scriptures, specifically the Padma Purana, and get this. They say that there are 8.4 million different species of life. They even break it down further into different categories, like creatures that live in the water, immobile things like plants, reptiles, birds, all sorts of animals, even human-like species. And they actually give specific number for each category. It's pretty wild.
8.4 million species.
Mhm.
Wow. Okay, so they're definitely recognizing the incredible diversity of life. But what determines which species a soul inhabits? Like, how do you end up as a human versus, I don't know, a fish?
Okay, so they say that the type of body a soul gets is directly related to its desires and merits. Basically, it's karma playing out. They quote some verses from the Bhagavad Gita that say the soul basically carries its desires and conceptions of life with it from one body to the next. So what you desire, what you do in this life, it shapes what you become in the next.
It's all about cause and effect. I'm starting to get it. What about the origin of humans specifically? What do they say about how humans came to be?
This is where it gets interesting. They present this idea that the human species actually originated from thousands of couples.
Thousands, not just one, like Adam and Eve.
Nope. Thousands. And they even point out that this aligns with certain scientific findings.
They seem to like bringing up science to back up their points.
They do. And it gets even wilder. Remember that massive timescale we talked about earlier? Well, they actually say that the human species has existed for the same amount of time as the universe itself, 155.522 trillion years. Again, they're basing this on the Vedic scriptures.
Okay, so no 6,000-year-old Earth for them. They're definitely going with a much, much older timeline.
Way older. And they even suggest that some scientific discoveries, like the really old human remains that have been found, actually support this idea of a much more ancient origin for humans.
Okay, so they've got this vast ancient histories for humans. But who, according to them, is ultimately responsible for all this? Who's the source of all this diverse life?
Well, they identify Lord Krishna as the original source. They call him the seed-giving father of all living beings. And of course, they bring in a bunch of quotes from the Bhagavad Gita to support this idea.
Lord Krishna, the ultimate creator.
Got it. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, but I want to make sure we address some of the common perceptions and even misconceptions about Sanatan Dharma. These sources actually make a point of tackling these head-on. They're not shying away from controversy. So let's get into it. The first one they address is no idol worship.
Right. This is a big one because a lot of people, when they think of Hinduism, they think of idols. But these sources are very clear that they do not endorse idol worship.
So what's the distinction they make? Like, what makes something an idol versus, well, whatever they consider okay?
The key difference, they say, is between what they call deities in Vedic temples and what most people would consider idols. So deities, they say, are infused with the life force. They're a manifestation of God's presence. And they claim millions of devotees have experienced this directly, that Lord Krishna himself has even appeared from these deity forms.
Wait, so they're saying that these deities are actually alive? That's what they believe. That's the distinction they're making. Idols, on the other hand, are just lifeless objects made of stone or metal. And they say bowing down to those things, believing they're inherently divine, that's idol worship.
So it's not the physical form itself that matters, it's the perceived spiritual presence behind it.
Exactly. It's about that connection to the divine.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, another big one they challenge is no eternal damnation. We touched on this earlier, but I think it's worth exploring a bit more. What's the logic behind this perspective?
They really go in on this one. They argue against the whole idea of eternal hell, especially the idea that you're condemned to it based on your religious beliefs. They bring up some interesting points like, what happens to babies who die? Or people who never even had the chance to learn about a specific religion? Would a merciful God condemn them for eternity? They just don't see it that way.
So their view is much more inclusive.
Way more. Their perspective, according to these sources, is that Lord Krishna doesn't send anyone to eternal suffering. He wants everyone to eventually return to the spiritual realm. It might take a long time, countless lifetimes even, but ultimately, that's the goal.
Okay, so everyone gets there eventually.
Yeah.
But how? What are the different pathways back to this spiritual realm?
They actually mention several. Like, you can pass away in Krishna's presence, that's one way. Or, if you die by Krishna's hand, fighting for a righteous cause, that also leads to the spiritual realm. And then, of course, being a devoted follower, that's a big one. But they also emphasize that everyone have unlimited chances through reincarnation.
So it's not a one-shot deal. You keep getting opportunities to grow and evolve.
Yeah.
Interesting. And they back all this up with scriptures.
Oh, they do. They quote from the Srimad Bhagavatam, the Bhagavad Gita. They give examples like stories from the Mahabharata War. They're not just asserting this, they're trying to provide evidence.
I can see that. They've definitely done their homework. Okay, the final misconception they tackle, and this one is a big one, is the no caste system. Now, caste, that's a super sensitive topic, especially within Hinduism. So how do they address this?
Yeah, they know it's a touchy subject, so they're very careful about how they explain it. Basically, they make a distinction between what they call the Vedic social work order system and the caste system, as it's often understood, the one based on birth.
Okay, so they're saying there's a difference between what the original teachings say and how things have played out in practice.
Exactly. They actually claim that the caste system, the way it's historically developed, is a corruption of the original Vedic principles. And they say the Vedic scriptures actually reject the idea of a social hierarchy that's based solely on your birth.
And they have quotes to back this up.
Oh, they do. They quote from the Bhavishya Purana specifically. They're not just making this up. They have textual support.
Okay, so if it's not based on birth, what is this Vedic social work order based on?
Well, they describe it as a societal structure that's based on your inherent qualities, your skills, and the kind of work you're naturally drawn to. They talk about four main categories. Like the first one is people who are inclined towards leadership and intellectual pursuits. Then there are those with administrative and protective abilities. And then those who are skilled in business, agriculture, taking care of animals. And finally, there are those who provide essential labor.
So kind of like a natural division of labor based on people's aptitudes.
That's how they present it. And they quote from the Bhagavad Gita and the Bhavishya Purana to describe the specific qualities associated with each group. They say the goal was to create a harmonious and efficient society, everyone playing their part based on their strengths.
It's an interesting idea.
Mm-hmm.
But how does this fit with their emphasis on the equality of all souls?
That's a good question. And they address it. They make it clear that the social work order wasn't meant to create a religious hierarchy or to prevent anyone from achieving spiritual liberation. Everyone has the same potential, they say, regardless of their role in society.
So your job doesn't determine your spiritual worth.
Not at all. They're actually pretty critical of how things are today. They say the lack of this functional social order based on qualities and work is a big part of why we see so many problems in society.
Okay, so they're making a connection between societal problems and the way we've strayed from this original system. But what about the idea that some people might just be born with certain predispositions? Like maybe they're just naturally inclined to certain qualities because of, past lives or something.
They actually acknowledge that. They say that some people might have these inherent inclinations towards certain qualities because of the consciousness they carry over from past lives, but they emphasize that you always have free will to develop different qualities, to choose a different path. They say the caste system, the rigid one based on birth, that's not sanctioned by the core Vedic teachings.
So you're not locked into a specific role just because of who your parents are.
Right. And they point out that some non-Vedic scriptures actually do authorize systems that divide people based on their religious beliefs, even creating those untouchable categories. They're very clear that they reject those ideas.
It's fascinating how they're weaving together these different ideas. The equality of souls, the social work order, free will, it's complex.
It is. There are a lot of layers here, but it's important to understand how they're interpreting these concepts.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now I want to switch gears again and get into scientific parallels and contrasts. Basically, how do these ancient teachings align with, or maybe diverge from, our modern scientific understanding?
All right, so when it comes to basic laws of science, they actually view time and matter as eternal energies that come from God, from Lord Krishna.
Eternal, so no beginning, no end.
Nope. They see it as always existing,
Wow.
and they have verses from the Bhagavad Gita to support this. They also reiterate that the soul is eternal, and they tie that back to the idea that the soul is a part of this eternal God.
Okay, so they're making a connection between the eternal nature of God, the soul, and the fundamental building blocks of the universe. But what about the Big Bang Theory? The idea that the universe began with this huge explosion. How do they reconcile that with their view of eternal time and matter?
Well, they actually critique the Big Bang Theory. They say it's unscientific.
Unscientific.
Really? Yeah. They argue that logically, creation can't just happen because of a random explosion. They have their own cosmology. They talk about this being called Mahavishnu, who exhales countless universes. And each of these universes, they say, has a lifespan of 311.040 trillion years. Then they get destroyed and recreated.
So cyclical creation and destruction on a massive scale.
Exactly. And to explain how this fits with their idea of eternal time and matter, they say that creation is basically a manifestation of God's eternal energies. It's like those energies are taking on different forms, which is consistent with the law of conservation of energy. Things are transforming, not just appearing out of nowhere.
Okay, that's a pretty clever way to bridge that gap. What about the characteristics of life itself? How do they define what makes something alive?
They say that the core symptom of life is consciousness, accompanied by some kind of form. They argue that, well, if every living being we see has a form and consciousness, then God, the source of all life, must also possess these things, just in a more superior, eternal way.
So if we have form and consciousness, God must too.
Interesting. And do they say anything about what form God takes?
They do. They actually mention that God appears in his original form roughly every 8.64 billion years.
Yeah.
And that he appears in other forms even more frequently. They even quote from the Bhagavad Gita about how some people, they might scoff at the idea of God having a human-like form. But they say that through devotion and spiritual practice, you can actually understand and see God.
Okay, so seeing God, that's a possibility in their view. It's not just blind faith.
Not at all. They're big on experience, on seeing things for yourself. And finally, there's one more scientific parallel they draw. Remember Newton's third law, the law of action and reaction? Yeah, vaguely.
Yeah.
Force equals mass times acceleration, right?
Well, the basic idea is that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And they link this directly to the law of karma. They present karma as this eternal, infallible principle of justice. It's not random, they say. It's this precise law that governs cause and effect.
So good actions, good consequences. Bad actions, bad consequences.
Essentially, yeah. But they take it further. They say that the kinds of actions you perform and the state of mind you're in when you do them, whether it's goodness, passion, or ignorance, that all impacts the kind of karmic reaction you'll experience. And that, in turn, affects what kind of body you'll have in your next life. They quote from the Bhagavad Gita a lot to explain all the nuances of this.
So it's not just about being a good person or a bad person. It's about the motivations behind your actions, the energy you're putting out into the world. Fascinating. Okay, we're in the home stretch now. I want to wrap things up by talking about the nature of God. What's their core understanding of who God is, what God is like?
Okay, so first and foremost, they really emphasize the oneness of God. They're very clear that there's only one supreme being, and they identify that being as Lord Krishna, but they also acknowledge that he manifests in various forms.
So one God, many forms. Okay, that makes sense. What else do they highlight about God?
Well, they talk about God's omnipresence, his all-pervading nature. They quote from the Bhagavad Gita things like, all beings reside within him, and he resides within all. They even talk about his presence as the super soul within every living being, even in plants and animals, even in every atom, they say.
Wow. So God is everywhere in everything. That's a pretty powerful concept. What about God's power? Like, what can he do?
Well, they describe him as omnipotent, meaning he's all-powerful. They say he's omniscient, meaning he knows everything. They call him the Supreme Father, who provides the seed of all life, the ultimate creator of everything, the supreme controller of everything that exists, and the maintainer who sustains all beings.
So he's the creator, the sustainer, the controller, the big guy.